Welcome back. If you joined me in the first part of this journey, you already know that the wars of faith in medieval Europe were not only fought by kings and knights, they were lived by everyone. By farmers who watched the road from their fields, by merchants who listened carefully to rumors in crowded markets, by families who learned to store grain, repair walls, and prepare quietly for whatever might arrive over the horizon. But something unusual began happening as these wars continued. People started improvising. They turned ordinary tools into defenses, temporary solutions into permanent systems. And sometimes very small decisions ended up changing the entire map of Europe. Tonight, we continue that story, the strange ways people survived, the inventions nobody planned, and the quiet, stubborn creativity that allowed medieval communities to endure centuries of uncertainty. So settle in wherever you're listening from tonight, and let's continue our slow journey through the long and restless world of medieval Europe. There is something comforting about ordinary objects. A wagon, for example, is one of the most ordinary things imaginable in medieval Europe. A wooden frame, 4 wheels, an axle that complains whenever the road grows uneven, and a space in the back for whatever must be moved from one place to another. Grain, barrels, timber, sometimes people, sometimes pigs, which tended to complain loudly about the arrangement. For centuries, wagons were simply tools of movement. They creaked along muddy roads, rattled through market gates, broke down inconveniently on hills, and generally behaved like large wooden boxes that had agreed reluctantly to cooperate with gravity. No one looked at a wagon and thought, "This will change warfare." But war has a way of forcing imagination upon the most ordinary materials. And in the early 15th century, in the uneasy landscape of Bohemia, wagons began living a second life. The Hussite Wars, like many wars of faith, began with sermons. Sermons often begin wars. Words gather people. People gather fears. Fears gather weapons. And eventually someone discovers that belief, once organized, tends to move toward confrontation. But the people who followed the Hussite cause were not always the sort of soldiers medieval Europe expected. They did not always possess the shining cavalry that aristocratic warfare admired so much. They did not always have castles strong enough to anchor their defences. Many of them were townsmen, farmers, craftsmen, people who understood wood, iron, wheels, tools, and the stubborn physics of everyday objects, which meant they looked at wagons differently. If you have enough wagons, and enough chains, and enough men willing to push and hammer and improvise, a wagon can become something more than transportation. It can become a wall. At first, the idea was probably simple. Wagons, placed in a rough circle, maybe linked together with chains, maybe reinforced with planks, maybe filled with supplies that conveniently also stop arrows. Nothing elegant, nothing designed by a grand architect of war, just a temporary defensive measure. Temporary measures have a habit of becoming traditions, especially when they work, and wagon defenses worked remarkably well. Medieval warfare had long been dominated by cavalry. Armored knights on powerful horses could break through poorly organized infantry like storms breaking through thin branches. Speed, weight, and momentum were the aristocratic language of the battlefield. But horses do not enjoy colliding with walls. And a ring of wagons, chained together, reinforced with boards and shields, and defended by determined men with crossbows, polearms, and early firearms, created a very inconvenient obstacle for charging cavalry. The horses slowed, the knights hesitated, arrows and shot flew from behind the wooden barrier, and suddenly the battlefield began behaving in ways that medieval aristocrats found deeply irritating. A farmer with a flail standing behind a wagon might defeat a knight who had trained for war his entire life. This was not supposed to happen, but history occasionally enjoys embarrassing its own expectations. The wagon forts, wagenburgs, as they were sometimes called, became more sophisticated with practice. Wagons were arranged carefully, gaps were controlled, entrances were protected, chains and hooks secured the vehicles together. Inside the circle, supplies were stored, weapons prepared, and fighters organized. The wagons could move when necessary, forming a traveling fortress that crept slowly across the landscape like a wooden animal that had learned patience. This mobility was crucial. Castles defend a fixed place. Wagon forts defended people. If danger approached, the fortress could move. If the enemy advanced, the fortress could close itself. If the battle ended, the fortress could roll away and appear somewhere else entirely. It was not beautiful in the way medieval warfare liked to imagine beauty. There were no gleaming towers, no banners flying dramatically above marble walls, just wood, iron, mud, and men who had discovered that survival sometimes favors stubborn practicality over heroic tradition. Inside these wagon circles, life continued in strange, compressed rhythms. Animals were tethered. Food was cooked over small fires. Weapons were repaired. Prayers were spoken. Arguments happened. Sleep came in uneasy pieces. The wagon fort was both camp and fortress, both home and shield, a place where ordinary tools had been rearranged into architecture. And as the Hussite Wars continued, the system became more refined. Commanders learned how to deploy the wagons quickly. Men learned their positions. Signals were understood. The improvised defense became a doctrine. This is the familiar medieval pattern again. A temporary solution becomes permanent through repetition. What begins as improvisation slowly hardens into expectation. New recruits learn the method. Veterans teach the arrangement. Craftsmen begin building wagons with the system in mind. The idea spreads. Soon the wagon is no longer simply a wagon. It is a military instrument. And perhaps the most remarkable detail is that nothing about the object itself had changed very much. The same wooden frames that once carried barley to market were now carrying survival through battle. History had not invented a new machine. It had simply looked at an old one differently, which is often how the most interesting changes occur. The aristocratic armies facing these wagon forts frequently reacted with disbelief at first. Surely this crude structure could not withstand a proper cavalry charge. Surely determined knights could scatter farmers hiding behind wooden carts. Surely war would behave the way war had always behaved. But war, like people, occasionally becomes bored with repeating itself. The wagon walls held. The horses hesitated. The charges faltered. and slowly the old assumptions of the battlefield began to crack. For the people inside those wooden circles, the wagon fort was not a clever tactical innovation. It was something much simpler. It was safety, or at least the closest approximation of safety available in a war that had grown large enough to swallow towns, armies, and ideas all at once. Inside the circle, the world made sense again. Outside, it waited with swords. And so the wagon continued its quiet transformation, from farm tool to moving wall, from transport to survival, from ordinary object to symbol of a new kind of war, one in which improvisation mattered more than pedigree, and where the humblest technology could quietly rearrange the balance between life and death. Not bad for a box on wheels. There is a particular kind of war that is much harder to survive than the others. Not the war between kingdoms, not the war between distant religions, but the war where the enemy lives down the street. At first glance, medieval Europe liked to imagine its wars of faith as something distant. Armies marching east toward Jerusalem, knights travelling across seas, pilgrims crossing continents with banners and prayers. Distance made the idea manageable. If the war was far away, daily life could continue. Fields could still be planted. Markets could still open. Families could still pretend that the great drama of Christendom was unfolding somewhere safely beyond the horizon. But sometimes the horizon moved, and when it moved, the war came home. In the early 13th century, in the warm and prosperous lands of southern France, people began hearing a word that carried a strange and dangerous weight: heresy. Now, heresy, in theory, is a theological concept, a disagreement about doctrine, a deviation from correct belief. Something scholars might debate in quiet rooms full of manuscripts and candles. In practice, heresy became something far more immediate, an accusation. And accusations travel quickly. Southern France at that time was not a place that felt particularly unstable. The region of Languedoc was wealthy, culturally lively, and filled with towns where trade, poetry, religion, and politics mingled in complicated ways. Local lords ruled their territories with a mixture of independence and negotiation. Cities enjoyed a surprising degree of autonomy. Religious life was active, diverse, and sometimes, from the perspective of Northern Church authorities, a little too creative. Among the religious movements present in the region were groups later known as the Cathars. To their followers, they were simply believers pursuing what they thought was a purer form of Christianity. To the church hierarchy, they represented a dangerous deviation. The disagreement might have remained a matter of sermons and debates. But medieval Europe had already learned a powerful administrative trick. If belief could mobilize armies against distant enemies, it could also mobilize armies against local ones. And so the language of crusade, the same language once used to summon knights to the Holy Land, was turned towards southern France. Suddenly, the struggle against heresy was not merely a matter for bishops and theologians. It was a war. And when war arrives in a region like Languedoc, it does not politely identify which houses contain the correct beliefs and which contain the incorrect ones. Cities were mixed. Families were mixed. Friends were mixed. In many towns, Catholics and Cathars lived side by side, shared markets, shared wells, shared streets, and shared the ordinary inconveniences of medieval life. without constantly demanding theological identification. But war dislikes ambiguity. Armies prefer categories, which meant that the first challenge for crusaders arriving in the region was simple and impossible at the same time. Who exactly are we supposed to kill? The famous and probably somewhat simplified story from the sack of Béziers captures this terrible confusion perfectly. When crusaders asked how they should distinguish heretics from faithful Catholics within the city, the answer attributed to one church official has echoed through history with chilling efficiency. Kill them all. God will know his own. Whether those exact words were spoken or not, the logic behind them was brutally real. Ambiguity had become inconvenient. And when ambiguity becomes inconvenient during war, it rarely survives. So the city of Béziers was taken, and thousands of people died. Not because each one had been carefully examined for theological correctness, but because war had transformed suspicion into certainty and certainty into violence. For the ordinary people of the region, this moment revealed something terrifying. It was no longer possible to remain neutral simply by living quietly. Belief had become something that armies might investigate, or punish, or assume. Neighbors began watching one another with slightly different eyes. A conversation that once felt harmless might suddenly feel risky. Who attends which sermon? Who speaks respectfully about certain religious teachers? Who seems too sympathetic to ideas the Church has condemned? These questions, once academic, began creeping into daily life, and daily life, as always, tried to adapt. Some people became very careful about what they said. Others emphasized their loyalty to the Church with extra enthusiasm. Some communities attempted to negotiate with crusading forces. Some towns fortified their walls. Some families fled before the armies arrived. Others stayed and hoped the storm would pass over them. But this was not a war that passed quickly. The Albigensian Crusade dragged on for years. Castles changed hands. Cities were besieged. Alliances shifted. Local nobles fought desperately to protect their lands. Northern crusaders carved out territories. And throughout all of this, ordinary people attempted to survive the same way they always had, by watching, by listening, by adapting faster than events around them. A merchant might learn which roads were safe and which were suddenly dangerous. A farmer might hide grain when soldiers approached. A family might decide which beliefs were safest to express publicly and which should remain private. And sometimes survival depended on something much more unpredictable: luck, because during wars of faith, once the machinery of accusation begins moving, it does not always stop where anyone expects. A person might be denounced. A neighbor might settle an old grievance through religious language. A rival might suddenly discover theological concerns about someone else's property. Human beings have always been remarkably creative when given moral vocabulary that justifies personal hostility. The crusade against heresy created exactly that vocabulary: faith, purity, correction, justice. Words that sounded noble when spoken from pulpits could become extremely practical tools in local conflicts. This did not mean everyone behaved cynically. Many crusaders believed sincerely that they were defending the true faith. Many clergy believed they were protecting souls from dangerous error. Many ordinary believers simply wanted clarity in a confusing religious landscape. But sincerity does not prevent tragedy. In fact, sincerity often sharpens it. And so, the war continued, city by city, castle by castle, village by village, until the region itself had been transformed, not only politically, but emotionally. Trust had been strained, communities had fractured, people had learned that belief, once connected to armies, could reshape every relationship around them. And perhaps the most unsettling part of all was how familiar the process became. Once the pattern was established, identify error, mobilize faith, send armies, the machinery could be used again and again. Because, like every other system we have encountered in these stories, it had begun as a temporary response, a way to solve a problem, a way to restore order, a way to defend truth. But repetition turned the temporary into something much more permanent, a structure, a habit, a method, and for the people living inside that method, survival meant learning one final lesson. In wars of faith, the most dangerous enemy was sometimes not the distant army marching toward your city. It was the moment when belief turned into suspicion, because suspicion spreads quietly. And once it enters a community, it can make every door feel less secure, even before the soldiers arrive. There are places in history where war feels like an interruption. And there are places where war becomes background noise. The frontier regions of medieval Iberia were one of those places. If you had grown up in the kingdoms of northern Spain sometime during the long centuries of what later historians would call the Reconquista, you might not have thought of yourself as living in a war at all. You were simply living near the frontier. Frontiers have their own personality. They are restless places, edges where languages mix, laws overlap, loyalties shift, and certainty becomes a luxury. A frontier town might contain merchants who traded with both sides, soldiers who had fought on both sides, priests who preached patience to people who had very little patience left, and farmers who were far more interested in the rain than in the theological identity of the army that might appear next spring, because life had to continue. Fields still needed planting, children still needed raising. Animals still wandered into the wrong fields no matter how many kingdoms were currently arguing about them. But the frontier changed the way people thought about safety. In most parts of Europe, war arrived as an event. On the frontier, war arrived as a possibility. Every season carried the small chance that riders might appear over the horizon. Sometimes they were raiders. Sometimes they were tax collectors. Sometimes they were soldiers. Sometimes they were merely travellers who looked suspicious enough to cause unnecessary alarm. After a few generations, people stopped reacting with panic. Instead, they developed habits. Villages were built differently. Houses clustered closer together. Small towers appeared in places where towers had never seemed necessary before. Walls were repaired frequently. Gates were watched carefully. These were not dramatic fortifications, like the castles of powerful kings. More often, they were practical defences. Thick doors, narrow streets, lookout points, places where a community could gather quickly if trouble appeared. The frontier taught people that survival rarely came from heroic battles. It came from preparation, from noticing dust clouds in the distance, from having a bell ready to ring, from knowing which path led into the hills if riders approached faster than expected. Children grew up learning these things the way children elsewhere learned farming or trade. They learned the sound of hooves. They learned the meaning of smoke rising where smoke should not be. They learned that adults sometimes listened to the horizon with a kind of quiet concentration that had nothing to do with prayer and everything to do with survival. But the frontier also produced something more complicated: trade. Because even while Christian and Muslim rulers fought across Iberia, the regions between them remained deeply connected. Merchants crossed the frontier regularly. Goods moved back and forth. Cloth, grain, horses, tools, spices, metals, things people needed did not stop being useful simply because the men who ruled the land disagreed about theology. This created a strange rhythm: war and trade existing side by side. A merchant might sell goods in a town that had been raided the year before and might be raided again the next year. A farmer might pay taxes to one ruler this decade and another ruler the next. A castle might change flags several times during a lifetime, while the village beneath it continued planting wheat in exactly the same fields. For the people living there, identity could become surprisingly flexible. Faith remained important, but survival demanded practicality. A shepherd, watching his flock, did not always ask which kingdom the riders belonged to before deciding whether to move the animals quickly. He simply moved them. Over time, the frontier produced communities that were unusually resilient, not because they loved war, but because they had learned how to live with its possibility without allowing it to consume every moment of life. People built routines around uncertainty. Market days were organized carefully. Travel routes were chosen with caution. Families maintained connections with relatives in safer regions. Supplies were stored more carefully than in places far from danger. And perhaps most importantly, people learned to negotiate. Negotiation is one of the least glamorous survival skills in history. It does not produce heroic stories, but it saves lives. Local leaders often struck temporary agreements with nearby powers. Tribute might be paid. Prisoners might be exchanged. Raids might be postponed. Armies might be persuaded to pass elsewhere. None of these arrangements lasted forever, but they did not need to. On the frontier, survival was rarely about permanent solutions. It was about the next season, the next harvest, the next winter. If a truce lasted long enough for crops to grow and children to survive another year, it had done its job. Of course, there were also moments when the frontier erupted into larger campaigns. Castles were taken, cities changed rulers, armies marched in impressive numbers. But even these dramatic moments eventually faded back into the quieter rhythm of frontier life. The fields were planted again. The markets reopened. Merchants resumed their journeys. Children who had watched soldiers pass through the streets grew up and became the adults who watched the horizon the same way their parents once had. And after enough generations, something remarkable happened. War stopped feeling exceptional. It became ordinary, not pleasant, not welcome, but familiar. A background condition of life, rather than a catastrophic interruption. And that familiarity shaped culture in subtle ways. The towns of Christian Spain developed strong martial traditions. Military service became a path to status. Frontier communities celebrated courage and endurance. Stories of raids and defenses became part of local identity. But beneath the heroic language, daily survival still depended on the same quiet skills. Watching the road, storing grain, listening for bells, knowing when to hide, knowing when to negotiate, knowing when to run. The frontier had taught its people a hard lesson. Wars of faith might claim to be about grand truths and eternal salvation, but surviving them often came down to smaller things: weather, food, walls, and the ability to live with uncertainty long enough for the next harvest to arrive. Because on the frontier, the war never truly ended. It simply paused between seasons. There is a moment before every great disaster when nothing has happened yet. The fields are still green. The roads are still open. The market still smells of bread, animals, and damp wool. And yet something has already begun. Not with swords, not with armies, but with whispers. Rumours in medieval Europe were not merely idle talk. They were a kind of weather system moving through society, invisible, unpredictable, and capable of changing the mood of entire towns before a single soldier had appeared on the horizon. The thing about rumours is that they travel lightly. They require no horses. They carry no baggage. They cross borders easily. A traveller mentions something in a tavern. A priest repeats it in a sermon, perhaps slightly improved for moral clarity. A merchant tells the story again in the next town, adding a detail he heard from someone who claimed to have been there. A pilgrim carries the tale across mountains, where it becomes larger still. By the time the rumour returns to its place of origin, it has become a certainty. And certainty, unfortunately, is a powerful fuel. During the Wars of Faith in medieval Europe, rumours often arrived long before armies did. Someone had heard that a city had been destroyed. Someone claimed that a miracle had appeared to guide the faithful. Someone whispered that enemies of the church had committed terrible acts. Someone insisted that a crusading army was marching toward the region and that it had already defeated everyone in its path. None of this needed to be verified, because the rumour was doing its work already. Fear spreads faster than news. A town that hears rumours of approaching violence begins preparing in quiet ways. Merchants sell certain goods more quickly. Families begin storing grain. Travellers become cautious. Doors close earlier in the evening. The sound of hooves on the road becomes something people listen for more carefully than before. Sometimes the army mentioned in the rumour never arrives. But the rumour has still changed everything. Markets behave differently. Neighbours become suspicious. People begin noticing details they would normally ignore. Why is that stranger asking questions about the town walls? Why has the priest been preaching more urgently than usual? Why did 3 families leave suddenly last week? Rumour turns ordinary details into possible signs of danger. And once people begin interpreting daily life as a collection of warnings, the atmosphere of a town changes dramatically. Trust becomes fragile. conversation becomes careful. Even small disagreements can suddenly feel dangerous if they occur during a time when everyone suspects something larger might be happening. Rumors about heresy were especially powerful. In regions where religious tension already existed, the suggestion that someone held the wrong beliefs could travel through a community like fire through dry grass. A neighbor might whisper that another family had attended suspicious sermons. A traveler might claim that certain houses were known to shelter heretics. A merchant might repeat a story he heard 2 towns away about punishments inflicted on those who failed to defend the faith. Each telling added weight. Each repetition made the story harder to challenge. And because medieval societies relied heavily on reputation, even an uncertain accusation could alter a person's position in the community almost overnight. A shopkeeper might notice fewer customers. A farmer might find fewer neighbors willing to help during harvest. A family might discover that invitations had quietly stopped arriving. The war had not begun yet, but suspicion had. Suspicion, once introduced into a community, rarely disappears quickly. It lingers. It changes the way people observe one another. It turns small differences into possible threats. And when armies finally arrive, they often discover that much of their work has already been done. Communities have already divided themselves. People have already chosen sides. Some families have already fled. Others have already prepared to welcome the soldiers they believe will defend the true faith. In this way, rumors act as advance scouts for war. They soften the ground. They reshape expectations. They prepare people emotionally for violence that might otherwise feel impossible. And this preparation can become strangely addictive, because rumors do not only produce fear, they also produce excitement. For some listeners, stories of holy war promise purpose, a chance to prove loyalty, a chance to correct injustice, a chance to participate in events that feel larger than ordinary life. And once excitement joins fear, rumor becomes even more powerful. Crowds gather. Preachers speak more passionately. Volunteers appear. People who might never have considered violence suddenly imagine themselves defending sacred truths. All of this happens before the first battle, before the first siege, before the first army even crosses the horizon. Which means that by the time war physically arrives, the emotional landscape has already been transformed. And in many ways, this emotional transformation is the most dangerous part of the process. Because once people have convinced themselves that conflict is necessary, stopping the conflict becomes extremely difficult. The rumor has already rewritten the story of the future. Now people are simply waiting for reality to catch up. For ordinary families trying to survive these times, the challenge was learning how to navigate this invisible storm. Some people ignored rumors as long as possible. Others collected them carefully, comparing stories from different travelers in an attempt to guess which ones might be true. Some prepared quietly for the worst. Some hoped that nothing would happen, and sometimes, of course, nothing did. The rumor passed through like a cold wind, and the town returned to its normal routines. But not always. Sometimes the rumor was simply the first messenger, and somewhere beyond the hills, the army it described was already marching. There are many things in history that were meant to be temporary: storm shelters, emergency laws, war taxes, and Almost inevitably, most of them discover that temporary arrangements are surprisingly comfortable once people grow used to them. The wars of faith in medieval Europe produced many such arrangements. At first, the logic seemed simple enough. A crusade required resources. Ships had to be built, weapons had to be purchased, supplies had to be gathered. Men had to travel long distances, often across unfamiliar territories, and none of this could happen without money. But the medieval church, despite its considerable influence, did not keep vast treasure vaults waiting to fund military expeditions whenever a sermon proved particularly inspiring. So when the first great crusading movements began, rulers and church authorities turned to a familiar solution. They asked everyone else to help pay. At first, these requests were framed in the language of urgency. This is a sacred cause. This is a temporary need. This is a contribution to the defense of the faith. Clergy might donate a portion of their income. Nobles might provide funds, equipment, or ships. Merchants might offer loans or logistical support. Even ordinary communities sometimes contributed small amounts toward the grand project unfolding beyond their fields. And in the beginning, most people understood the arrangement. A war was happening. Wars were expensive. Extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary sacrifices. But wars, like rumors and institutions, have a habit of lasting longer than anyone initially expects. Years passed. New expeditions were planned. New armies assembled. New calls for assistance were issued. And gradually, the extraordinary contribution began to look less extraordinary. It became something people expected to hear again. A new crusade meant new collections. A new campaign meant new appeals for funds. And somewhere in the process, a quiet transformation took place. The temporary tax became a system. Money began moving through organized channels. Officials appeared whose job was to collect and manage these funds. Records were kept. Permissions were granted. Exceptions were negotiated. The machinery of finance began humming quietly beneath the language of faith. At first, this system seemed helpful. After all, organized funding meant crusades could be planned more effectively. Supplies could be gathered more reliably. Armies could move with slightly greater confidence that food, ships, and equipment would appear when needed. But systems have a way of developing interests of their own. Once a structure exists to collect resources, someone must maintain it. Someone must supervise it. Someone must ensure it continues functioning. And the easiest way to keep a system alive is to keep finding reasons to use it. This did not mean that church leaders secretly invented crusades for financial convenience. History is rarely that tidy. But it did mean that once the financial infrastructure of holy war existed, organizing another expedition became administratively easier than before. The roads of money had already been built. Clerks knew the procedures. Local authorities knew what was expected. Communities had heard the arguments before. And familiarity has a strange effect on people. The first time a new tax appears, it produces outrage. The second time, irritation. The third time, weary acceptance. By the fourth time, people begin budgeting for it. In medieval Europe, This process unfolded slowly but steadily. Clergy contributed portions of their revenues. Kings negotiated their own involvement in crusading finance. Merchants discovered that transporting supplies to crusading armies could become profitable. Shipbuilders learned that holy war meant steady demand for vessels. Even distant communities sometimes found themselves connected to the economy of crusade through taxes, donations, or trade, and thus another temporary response to crisis became a permanent feature of society. The wars of faith had created not only armies and fortresses, but financial networks, networks that linked monasteries, cities, ports, and courts across vast distances. Money collected in a quiet European parish might eventually help supply soldiers fighting thousands of miles away. Few of the people paying these contributions would ever see the places their money helped sustain. But they were part of the system nonetheless. And like all systems, this one produced unintended consequences. Some communities began resenting the financial burden. Others adapted by developing new economic activities connected to crusading logistics. Some individuals grew wealthy through contracts and trade. Others struggled to meet the demands placed upon them. The sacred language surrounding these taxes remained powerful. Supporting the defense of the faith sounded noble, but noble language does not always make practical difficulties disappear. A farmer whose harvest had failed still owed his obligations. A monastery managing declining revenues still faced expectations of contribution. A merchant balancing risks might discover that the holy cause had complicated his ledgers considerably. And so medieval Europe gradually adjusted, not with enthusiasm perhaps, but with the quiet resignation that accompanies any system which proves durable enough to survive several generations. The war had created a financial rhythm. Funds gathered, expeditions launched, funds gathered again, and each cycle strengthened the structures that supported the next. It was another example of a pattern we have seen many times already. A solution designed for a single crisis becomes a habit. A habit becomes an institution. An institution reshapes the lives of people who never intended to participate in its creation. Somewhere in a village, far from any battlefield, a priest reads a letter requesting contributions for another holy expedition. A farmer sighs. A merchant recalculates his accounts. A clerk prepares a document. And the war continues, not only in distant lands or fortified cities, but in the quiet arithmetic of everyday life. There is a moment in many medieval stories when someone invites help. A ruler faces a problem. Perhaps the borders are unstable. Perhaps nearby tribes are difficult neighbors. Perhaps the land is wide and thinly defended, and the ruler has begun sleeping poorly at night because of it. So he writes letters. He sends envoys. He asks for assistance. And somewhere far away, men who specialize in solving problems with armor and discipline begin to take interest. At first, the arrangement seems simple. Help us. Fight our enemies. Protect our lands. In return, you will receive privileges, supplies, and gratitude. It is a very medieval kind of agreement. The problem, as it turned out more than once, was that the men being invited sometimes had ideas of their own. The Teutonic Knights were one such group. Originally, they were not intended to become rulers of anything. Like the Hospitallers, we spoke about earlier, they had begun with a religious purpose connected to the crusading movement. They were a military order brothers who combined religious vows with the responsibilities of soldiers. They fought, they defended, they organized, and they did these things extremely well, which made them very attractive allies. In the early 13th century, a Polish duke named Conrad of Mazovia faced a persistent problem along his northern frontier. Beyond his lands lived the Prussians' pagan tribes, who resisted Christian expansion and occasionally conducted raids into neighboring territories. Conrad had tried dealing with the situation through his own forces, but the frontier remained stubbornly unstable, so he turned to the Teutonic Knights. Come north, help secure the border, convert the pagans, bring order to the region. From Conrad's perspective, it must have seemed like a sensible arrangement. The knights were disciplined. They had experience fighting in crusading campaigns. They carried the approval of powerful religious authorities. Surely they would solve the problem, and for a time, they did. The Teutonic Knights arrived with organization, determination, and a very clear sense of how frontier warfare should be conducted. They built castles, strong ones, stone fortresses rising above rivers and forests, placed carefully so that each stronghold supported the next. Castles create stability. They also create control. Around these castles, towns began to appear. Settlers arrived. Merchants followed. Fields were cleared. Roads developed. The frontier, once uncertain, began taking on a new shape. But as the system expanded, a quiet question began emerging. Who exactly owned this growing territory? The Teutonic Knights had been invited as helpers, but they had secured papal approval. They had imperial recognition. They possessed a disciplined army and a network of fortifications, and gradually it became clear that the knights did not see themselves merely as guests. They saw themselves as rulers. The frontier they had come to stabilize was becoming their state. Castles multiplied. Administrative centers appeared. Taxes were collected. Law was enforced. The order governed its lands with the efficiency of a military institution that understood exactly how to organize territory. And because the region was still considered part of a crusading frontier, the knights attracted support from across Europe. New recruits arrived. Resources flowed in. The war against pagan neighbors continued, reinforcing the sense that the state itself existed as part of a holy mission. From a certain perspective, it worked remarkably well. The Teutonic Order created a powerful and organized realm along the Baltic coast. Cities such as Marienburg became impressive centers of administration and military strength. Trade flourished in some areas. The frontier was transformed into a network of castles, towns, and disciplined authority. But systems that grow from war rarely remain comfortable for everyone living inside them. Local populations discovered that the new rulers were not merely protectors, they were landlords. Taxes had to be paid. Laws had to be obeyed. Land ownership changed. Peasants who had once lived with relative independence sometimes found themselves under stricter control. The military state demanded order. And order, when enforced by armored monks living in massive fortresses, could feel very heavy. Over time, resentment grew. The knights had solved one problem, the instability of the frontier, but had created another. They had become permanent, and permanent powers develop interests of their own. Neighbors who had once welcomed their help began questioning their authority. Cities sometimes resisted. Local nobles sometimes rebelled. Even the wider political world of Europe eventually began challenging the Order's dominance. The great defeat of the Teutonic Knights at the Battle of Grunwald in 1410 revealed that the military state they had built was not invincible. But by that time the transformation had already taken place. A military order, invited to solve a temporary frontier problem, had created a lasting political entity. Another example of the same pattern we have seen again and again. Temporary solution, repeated success, growing responsibility, permanent structure. And for the people living in the lands governed by the order, survival meant adapting once again. Farmers adjusted to new laws. Merchants navigated new trade systems. Settlers built lives under the shadow of castles that had not existed a generation earlier. The wars of faith had not only moved armies across Europe, they had redrawn the map. And sometimes those new lines remained long after the original wars had faded into memory. All because someone once asked for help securing a border. History often begins with requests that seem perfectly reasonable at the time. Chapter 13. Learning to live with uncertainty. There is a particular skill that rarely appears in heroic chronicles. It does not involve swords. It does not require armor, and no one writes songs about it. But it is one of the most important survival skills any society can develop. The skill is this: learning how to live with uncertainty without collapsing. By the time several generations had passed through the wars of faith in medieval Europe, many communities had quietly acquired this ability. Not because they wanted to, but because history had insisted. When a crisis happens once, people panic. When it happens twice, people remember. When it happens 10 times across a lifetime, people adapt. The roads bring armies. The roads carry them away. Cities are besieged. Cities recover. Taxes appear. Taxes disappear. Rumors spread. Rumors fade. After enough cycles, something changes in the way people see the world. Danger becomes expected. Not constant, but possible. Always possible. And this awareness shapes daily behavior in subtle ways. A merchant preparing for a journey packs his goods carefully, but he also carries extra supplies in case roads suddenly close. A farmer stores more grain than he technically needs because he remembers the year when soldiers passed through and took half the harvest. A town council repairs its walls not only after damage, but regularly, as a habit. Parents teach children which paths lead into the forest, which gates of the city close first, which bells signal danger. None of this feels dramatic. It feels practical, which is exactly why it works. Human beings are remarkably good at normalizing difficult conditions. A generation that grows up hearing stories of siege and crusade will treat them differently than a generation encountering such events for the first time. Children who play in the streets of a frontier town may grow accustomed to the sight of armed travelers. Young men who hear sermons about defending the faith may consider military service part of ordinary life. Young women may learn early how to manage households when fathers, brothers, or husbands leave for war, and gradually the extraordinary becomes routine. Markets continue operating even when distant campaigns are underway. Church services include prayers for soldiers, the way they include prayers for rain. Merchants track the political climate of distant regions, the way farmers track the weather. War is not forgotten, but it is absorbed. This does not mean people stop fearing violence. It means they reorganize their expectations around it. A family might celebrate a good harvest while quietly wondering whether soldiers will appear before winter. A merchant might enjoy a profitable season while keeping part of his wealth hidden in case the roads become unsafe again. A town might hold festivals while maintaining a watch on the walls. Life continues, always continuing. That persistence is one of the quiet miracles of history. Even in regions repeatedly touched by crusades, rebellions, sieges, and religious conflict, daily life rarely stopped entirely. People still married, children were still born, craftsmen still worked, monks still copied manuscripts, farmers still watched the sky for rain. Survival depended not on eliminating danger, but on weaving it into the rhythm of ordinary existence. Communities developed customs shaped by this reality. Storage systems improved. Communication networks strengthened. Alliances between towns and villages became more important. Travel routes shifted toward safer corridors. In some places, watchtowers dotted the landscape, small reminders that vigilance had become part of everyday architecture. In others, fortified churches offered refuge during sudden attacks. These structures were not always dramatic. Often, they were modest buildings adapted to new purposes. But they represented something important. Preparation had become normal, and preparation allowed life to continue even when uncertainty lingered. The wars of faith created systems, armies, taxes, and institutions. But they also created habits of caution, habits of cooperation, habits of quiet endurance. And those habits may have been the most important survival tool of all, because institutions can collapse, armies can lose battles, kings can die, but habits, especially habits learned through necessity, tend to survive. A village that has learned how to hide grain will remember that skill for generations. A town that has survived siege will maintain its walls. A merchant who has navigated dangerous roads will teach his apprentices the same routes. Knowledge accumulates. Experience accumulates. And over time, entire regions develop a kind of cultural memory of survival. They know, even if no one says it aloud, that peace can be fragile, but life continues anyway. The children growing up in such places may not think of themselves as living in extraordinary times. They simply inherit the rhythms shaped by those who came before them. Listen for rumors, store food, watch the roads, trust carefully, prepare quietly, and above all, keep living. Because history rarely offers long periods of certainty, but it does offer opportunities for endurance. And endurance, though rarely celebrated in songs, is often what carries communities through the most difficult centuries. It is easy, when speaking about war, to imagine the battlefield as the center of everything. Armies clash, cities fall, kings make decisions, and history moves forward. But if you watch carefully, very carefully, you begin to notice that war often changes the world in quieter ways. not only through victories and defeats, but through habits, through structures, through the small adjustments people make in order to survive. Over time, those adjustments accumulate, and eventually, the world itself begins to look different. The wars of faith in medieval Europe did not simply produce armies marching across landscapes. They produced roads that became busier than they had ever been before. Pilgrims, soldiers, merchants, messengers, and wandering preachers all traveled along the same routes, creating networks of movement that stretched across the continent. A road that once connected two villages might suddenly become part of a much larger system, linking cities hundreds of miles apart. Travelers carried not only goods, but news, ideas, stories, warnings. Markets expanded, ports grew. Cities that could supply armies became wealthier. Shipbuilders discovered that holy war created a steady demand for vessels capable of crossing the Mediterranean. Merchants learned to follow crusading routes with careful attention. Where soldiers went, trade often followed. Where trade followed, towns expanded. And slowly, almost without anyone intending it, the geography of Europe began to change. Some places grew larger, others became quieter. New centers of activity appeared where none had existed before. Meanwhile, the institutions created during the wars continued evolving. Military orders built networks of castles and hospitals. Administrative systems developed to manage taxation and logistics. Legal structures emerged to handle the complicated property arrangements created when thousands of people left their homes for distant campaigns. All of these systems had originally been designed for very specific problems. But once they existed, they proved useful for other purposes as well. A fortress built for crusaders might later defend a trade route. A tax system designed to fund an expedition might later support a kingdom's regular administration. A road cleared for armies might become the preferred route for merchants. History rarely wastes infrastructure, and infrastructure, once built, quietly shapes the future. At the same time, cultural changes were unfolding. Communities that had experienced centuries of religious conflict developed stronger ideas about identity. Faith remained central, but it now interacted with politics, economics, and regional loyalty in new ways. Stories of crusade, defense, and survival entered local traditions. Songs were sung, chronicles were written, legends grew around the events people had witnessed. The memory of the wars became part of Europe's shared imagination. Yet daily life remained stubbornly ordinary. Farmers still worried about rain. Merchants still argued over prices. Children still played in the streets of cities that had once been besieged. The extraordinary had become part of the background. This may be the most remarkable feature of medieval resilience. Even after generations of conflict, societies continued building, trading, worshipping, and creating families. War changed them, but it did not erase them. Instead, it layered new habits over older ones. Fortified towns continued functioning as centers of trade. Military orders continued operating hospitals and protecting travelers. Frontier communities continued negotiating the uncertain balance between peace and violence. And the systems originally created to fight religious wars slowly blended into the broader structure of European society. By the late Middle Ages, many of these institutions no longer seemed unusual. They were simply part of the world. Castles guarded roads. Taxes supported governments. Religious orders managed land and wealth. Cities maintained defences. Merchants navigated long-distance trade networks. The wars of faith had reshaped Europe, not only through destruction, but through construction, through the quiet building of systems designed to survive crisis. And once those systems existed, they helped shape the centuries that followed. But if you had asked an ordinary villager during those years whether he believed he was witnessing the creation of a new Europe, he would probably have laughed. People rarely see their own time in such grand terms. They see the harvest, the market, the weather, the road especially, because as long as the road remained open, life could continue. Travellers could pass, trade could flow, news could arrive, and somewhere beyond the hills, armies might still march in the name of faith. But inside the villages and towns of Europe, people had already learned the most important lesson of all. The world changes slowly, and survival often depends on noticing the small changes long before anyone else realizes they matter. In the end, most people in medieval Europe did not fight in the wars of faith. They heard about them, they paid for them, they fed the armies that passed through, they watched the roads carefully, but they did not ride beneath banners or stand in the front lines of battle. They lived somewhere nearby, and living nearby was often complicated enough. If you return quietly to the countryside where we began this story, you will find something interesting. The fields are still there. The roads still run between villages. The bells still ring from church towers at the same hours they rang generations earlier. History has moved across these places many times, and yet daily life has a stubborn habit of reassembling itself once the noise passes. A farmer wakes before sunrise, not because history demands it, but because animals are hungry. A woman carries water from a well that has survived several wars without ever learning the names of the kings who fought them. Children run through streets that once held frightened crowds during a siege and now hold nothing more dramatic than spilled grain and barking dogs. The world, after a while, resumes its ordinary shape. But it is not exactly the same world. People remember things. They remember the year soldiers took the oxen. They remember the winter when refugees arrived at the gates. They remember the rumor that spread through the market like smoke before the army appeared. They remember the taxes collected for distant wars that most of them would never see. And memory changes behavior. A farmer who once stored only enough grain for the winter might now store more. A town that once repaired its walls only after damage might now maintain them regularly. A merchant might choose his travel routes with greater caution. Parents might teach their children small lessons about watching the road. None of these adjustments are dramatic, but together they create something powerful. Experience. Experience is the quiet inheritance of difficult centuries. No proclamation announces it. No monument celebrates it. But it shapes the decisions people make long after the battles themselves have been forgotten. In some regions of Europe, entire landscapes began reflecting this accumulated knowledge. Villages clustered closer together. Churches were built with thicker walls. Small towers appeared beside farms. Town gates became stronger. Roads shifted toward safer paths. These were not the grand castles of kings. They were the practical architecture of survival. Structures built by communities that had learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, how to continue living even when the wider world felt uncertain. Because survival, in the end, is rarely about defeating every danger. It is about enduring them long enough for ordinary life to rebuild itself afterward. And ordinary life is remarkably persistent. Even in centuries filled with crusades, sieges, rebellions, and religious conflicts, people continued doing the same simple things that people everywhere have always done. They planted seeds. They repaired tools. They traded goods. They married. They raised children. They prayed. And sometimes they watched the road. Watching the road became a habit in many places touched by the wars of faith. Not because danger was constant, but because experience had taught people that danger sometimes arrived quietly, a distant cloud of dust, an unfamiliar rider, a rumor carried by a traveler who stopped only long enough to drink water before continuing on his way. These small signals mattered. Communities that noticed them early could prepare. Communities that ignored them sometimes paid a higher price. So people watched, not with panic, with patience, because patience is one of the oldest survival skills in human history. The wars of faith eventually faded into memory. Armies stopped marching so often. Frontiers shifted. New political struggles replaced older ones. But the habits learned during those centuries remained. Caution, preparation, resilience, the understanding that the world can change quickly, but daily life can endure if people are willing to adapt. And so, the farmer continues his work. The merchant loads his cart. The priest rings the bell. The children grow older. And somewhere beyond the hills, history continues doing what it has always done, moving slowly, unpredictably, and often with far less concern for human comfort than we might prefer. But in the villages and towns scattered across Europe, people have already learned the quiet art that carried them through those centuries of uncertainty. They continue, they rebuild, they prepare. And when evening falls, when the fields grow quiet, and the road outside the village finally empties, the world looks almost peaceful again. Not perfectly safe, but calm enough. And sometimes, after enough difficult years, calm is more than anyone hoped for.